Welcome to a special series called How Did We Get Here? In honor of Black History Month, and for this first video in the series, What White America Can Learn from Black Politics, we'll explore how America's history of voter suppression has led us to where we are now and the resilient African American spirit fighting back against that suppression. The issue of voter suppression isn't new. For many, it's a reminder of 2000, except this time, it wasn't an accident. It was a carefully orchestrated strategy. Greg Palast, in his powerful analysis of the 2024 election, argues that Kamala Harris would have won the presidency if not for the widespread suppression of votes, a claim that should alarm every American who believes in democracy, especially any Harris voter. Palast's investigation shines a light on the dark truth. Vote suppression stole millions of votes, primarily from people of color. His data reveals that 4.8 million voters were wrongly purged from the rolls. And in states like Georgia and Texas, laws were passed, sometimes with an explicit racial intent, to limit voter access. Greg Palast highlights how mail-in ballots, especially in Black majority areas, were disproportionately rejected. These disenfranchised voters weren't just erased from the record, they were erased from our democracy. This is about real people and real Americans who had their voices silenced. It's about the freedom to vote being hijacked. We'll dive into how these methods aren't random. They are a continuation of racist and classist policies that have long sought to undermine the power of marginalized communities. And yet, in the face of this, the African American spirit has endured, building communities, inspiring social movements, and propelling political change. This story isn't only about loss, it's about resilience. It's about the courage of civil rights leaders, both past and present, who stood up against this system and said, no more. It's about people like Stacey Abrams, whose efforts in Georgia are a modern testament to the resilience and power of organizing. Throughout American history, despite the unyielding forces of oppression, the African American spirit has never broken. In the face of voter suppression, disenfranchisement, and systemic racism, Black Americans and other minorities have continually found ways to not only survive, but thrive. This spirit has been forged in pain, loss, and suffering, but it has also been defined by a profound sense of community, resilience, and hope. In the next sections, we'll trace the history of voter suppression, from the 3/5 Compromise to modern-day voter ID laws. We'll examine the profound emotional and social costs of this suppression, but also celebrate the African American spirit, one that, despite centuries of pain, loss, and struggle, continues to rise, fight, and demand justice. But before we move forward, it's important to emphasize that race is a social construct and a lie. We're all related, and our DNA is 99.9% the same. For a deep dive into that topic, check out my video, The Greedy History of Race and Why We're All Ancestrally African, or my other videos on the subject. But back to today's topic. Next, the journey of resistance, triumph, and hope. Because the fight for freedom and equality is far from over. Voter suppression is not just a product of the modern-day political landscape. It is embedded deep in the history of America. The struggle for voting rights has been long and hard-fought, with Black Americans bearing the brunt of a system designed to keep them powerless. The notion that voter suppression is a new tactic is misleading. For centuries, policies have been crafted specifically to deny Black Americans and other minorities the right to vote, and this story begins long before the election of 2024. From the founding of this nation, Black people were seen as less than fully human, legally at least. The 3/5 Compromise, a shameful part of the U.S. Constitution, dictated that enslaved Black people would only be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation and representation. While this compromise gave the Southern states more political power in Congress, it simultaneously reinforced the idea that Black people were not full citizens. The legal and social systems were explicitly designed to disenfranchise them. The seeds of the civil rights movement were sown in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War during the era of Reconstruction, 1865-1877. After the Union's victory over the Confederacy, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, formally abolishing slavery, granting citizenship to former slaves, and securing the right to vote for Black men. However, these legal victories were met with fierce resistance from the Southern states, where white supremacy remained deeply entrenched. By the late 1800s, Southern states began implementing a series of laws designed to bypass the 15th Amendment and keep Black Americans from voting. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses all worked to suppress the black vote. In 1890, Mississippi led the way with a new state constitution that effectively disenfranchised nearly all African Americans in the state. This strategy, which became known as Jim Crow laws, soon spread throughout the South, leaving black voters effectively powerless. But black America soon discovered that they weren't powerless at all. Resistance wasn't confined to legal battles alone. It was often quiet, subtle, and sometimes even invisible to those who weren't directly affected. But beneath the surface of systemic racism and disenfranchisement, the black community was always fighting back in small, persistent ways through grassroots organizing, through education, and most importantly, through community resilience. The 20th century marked a turning point in the struggle for black rights, as the Great Migration, 1916 to 1970, saw millions of black Americans move from the rural South to urban centers in the North and West, where they found new opportunities to organize, to speak out, and to demand equality. By the early 1900s, a new generation of black leaders had emerged, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, and Marcus Garvey, who were laying the intellectual and philosophical groundwork for future action. These figures created spaces for dialogue, mobilization, and protest, laying the foundation for what would later become the civil rights movement. At the same time, black churches, which had long been community centers of support and solidarity, began to take on a more overtly political role, organizing protests, voter registration drives, and education programs. Communities that were continually told that they didn't matter were beginning to find their voice and strength, building a network of resistance that would challenge the very heart of the Jim Crow system. This undercurrent of resistance remained steady, though often unnoticed by mainstream America, until the 1950s and 1960s, when it would erupt into a national struggle for justice. Through sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches, black Americans would once again claim their right to vote, breathe, and be heard in a nation that had for so long denied them that fundamental right. The idea that resistance could lead to victory would soon become a reality as a movement fueled by pain, sacrifice, and unshakable hope began to gain unstoppable momentum. The civil rights movement didn't begin on one day or with one leader. It was the culmination of decades of quiet resistance, leading to the fierce public challenges that would ultimately change the course of American history, or so we thought. In the 1940s and 1950s, the post-war civil rights movement began to take shape as black Americans like Thurgood Marshall laid the intellectual and legal groundwork for what would become a nationwide fight for equality. Legal victories such as Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, which declared school segregation unconstitutional, paved the way for further mobilization. The 1950s and 1960s marked the height of the civil rights movement as black leaders emerged to champion justice and mobilize action. Central to this movement was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose philosophy of nonviolent protest became the rallying cry for millions seeking to dismantle the entrenched racial caste system. It was during this period that the American conscience began to truly grapple with the brutal reality of racial inequality, and more importantly, the ways that racism was embedded in the nation's laws and institutions. The struggle wasn't just about political representation, it was a fight for human dignity. While the southern states worked tirelessly to solidify the social and legal structures of segregation, black Americans were already sowing the seeds of resistance that would grow into a full-fledged movement for civil rights. Their cause and inclusivity became blueprints to other groups, such as Native Americans, LGBT, and Americans with disabilities. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-1956 became one of the first large-scale protests that symbolized the power of black resistance. After Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a bus, the African-American community in Montgomery, Alabama, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others, organized a boycott of the city's buses. This successful protest demonstrated the power of collective action, and it ignited a nationwide movement that spanned the next decade. The freedom rides, sit-ins, marches, and voter registration drives that followed were marked by bravery and sacrifice. Thousands of black Americans and their allies risked their lives to challenge segregation, Jim Crow laws, and the racial injustice that permeated daily life in the South. The crescendo of the movement came with the March on Washington in 1963. More than 250,000 people gathered in the nation's capital to demand jobs, justice, and equality. Dr. King's iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered that day, painted a vision of a future where Black Americans would no longer be shackled by the chains of racism and disenfranchisement. The march highlighted a broad demand for voting rights, economic justice, and an end to racial segregation. But even as the March on Washington galvanized the nation, the fight was far from over. The Freedom Summer of 1964 saw volunteers from across the country travel to the South to register Black voters and combat the systemic barriers preventing them from voting. That summer, more than 1,000 activists faced violence, including the murder of 3 young volunteers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, whose deaths would help build momentum for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Over the next few decades, the civil rights movement brought together communities across the country, uniting people to fight for equality and the right to vote. After years of struggle, the turning point came on March 7, 1965, when police attacked peaceful protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The brutal images of law enforcement beating unarmed protesters sparked national outrage, leading to a swift response from the federal government. Less than 5 months later, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The Voting Rights Act was a monumental achievement, prohibiting the use of literacy tests, poll taxes, and other discriminatory practices that had been used to prevent Black Americans from voting. It also provided federal oversight of elections in areas with a history of discrimination, ensuring that Black citizens had unfettered access to the ballot box. While this was a historic victory, the journey did not end with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The fight for voting rights, equality, and justice continues, as evidenced by the voter suppression tactics we see today. But the civil rights movement, through nonviolent protest, sacrifice, and unity, changed the course of history, proving that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be overturned by the collective will of the people. For a time, the country seemed to be moving in the right direction. But despite the civil rights victories of the 1960s, voter suppression tactics adapted. These days, the tactics have become less overt, but are no less effective. Voter ID laws, strict voter registration laws, and gerrymandering continue to disenfranchise people, disproportionately affecting Black Americans and other marginalized communities. The Supreme Court's 2013 decision in Shelby County v. Holder, which weakened the Voting Rights Act, opened the floodgates for a resurgence of voter suppression across the country, especially in swing states. That, combined with the Citizens United ruling in 2010, which granted the rich the ability to put unlimited money in politics, had severe consequences for American elections. Suppression tactics we saw in 2024 are not only effective, they are also part of a well-coordinated effort to secure political power through the denial of equal voting access. This brings us to the present day, where voter suppression is no longer a matter of denying a group the legal right to vote. It's about finding ways to make it harder for certain communities to cast their ballots. The modern systems in place aren't as easy to see, but they are all too real. And the most insidious part of this fight is that it often involves the deliberate manipulation of electoral systems, something that Palast's report emphasizes as a calculated strategy by those in power in Washington today. For a deep dive into an effectively used voter suppression tactic, that of voter challengers, watch Greg's movie Vigilantes, Inc., link in description. But even in the face of this discrimination, the African American spirit has endured, rising from each setback to demand justice. From the Montgomery bus boycott to Selma, from the March on Washington to the streets of Ferguson, Black leaders and activists have always been on the front lines. Today, this legacy continues with leaders like Stacey Abrams, Keisha Lance Bottoms, and Black Lives Matter, who are all part of a new wave of activism fighting for voting rights and equality. The question we must now ask is, how do we overcome these tactics of suppression? How do we, as a nation, ensure that every citizen can cast their vote without fear of intimidation or exclusion? And how do we make sure the pain and loss of the past are not repeated for future generations? As I discussed in my related video, Reclaiming the Democratic Party for the People, we need a mass movement like that of the Civil Rights era. And it's probably already started. Many of us are still reconciling ourselves to this new Trump America, but we'll stand united for liberty. We'll stand for a democracy where every American can vote and have their vote counted for America. For the patriots who crossed the Delaware, for our Union soldiers, for our fallen from all over America in the world wars. For Rosa Parks, for Martin Luther King Jr., for the modern patriots of today, we need a movement. But even in today's political climate, we are still seeing this spirit of Black America endure. New leaders have stepped forward to carry the mantle of the civil rights movement. Stacey Abrams, perhaps the most prominent of these leaders, has spent years organizing and advocating for voting rights, particularly in Georgia. Her work in registering voters and fighting voter suppression helped turn Georgia blue in the 2020 election. Abrams' leadership shows how the fight for voting rights is not just about protesting. It's about organizing, empowering communities, and ensuring that people have access to the tools they need to participate in democracy. Other leaders like Keisha Lance Bottoms, Raphael Warnock, and Brittany Packnett Cunningham represent the ongoing legacy of the civil rights movement. They fight against voter suppression while continuing to uplift and inspire Black communities to engage in politics and social activism. They represent the new generation of activists who are building on the lessons of history and fighting to ensure that the right to vote remains protected. The problem, however, is not just about electing new leaders. It is also about ensuring that all citizens, regardless of skin color, gender, or lack thereof, income, or political affiliation, have access to a fair and equal vote. The more we acknowledge how voter suppression continues to harm not only Black Americans, but all marginalized groups, the more we realize that our democracy itself is at stake. In the face of voter suppression, the question arises, what can we do to ensure that our voices are heard and that this democratic process remains fair for all? How can we follow in the footsteps of our ancestors who fought for justice, equality, and the right to vote? Here are concrete steps we can take as individuals and as a society. 1. Register to vote. This might seem simple, but voter registration remains a critical first step. Many people are not even aware they are not registered, or that they need to re-register after moving or changing addresses. 2. Educate yourself and others. Knowledge is power. Understanding how voter suppression works and sharing that knowledge can empower others to take action. Share information about voting rights and election laws in your community. 3. Fight voter ID laws and poll taxes. Voter ID laws disproportionately affect marginalized groups. Advocate for more accessible forms of identification and challenge these restrictive measures wherever possible. 4. Support local organizing efforts. There are countless organizations working on the front lines of the fight against voter suppression. Support them with your time, money, and resources. Groups like Fair Fight Action, Black Voters Matter, and the Advancement Project work tirelessly to protect voting rights and combat disenfranchisement. 5. Hold elected officials accountable. Reach out to your local representatives and demand that they protect voting rights, oppose gerrymandering, and advocate for national voting rights legislation. Your voice can make a difference in their decisions. 6. Advocate for election reform. Support reforms like automatic voter registration, early voting, same-day registration, and vote by mail, which can remove barriers to voting and ensure that every eligible voter can cast their ballot. 7. Get involved. Whether through community organizing, participating in marches, or volunteering at the polls, being actively engaged in the political process is crucial to preserving democracy. 8. Vote. This might seem like an obvious one, but it's often the most overlooked. Voting isn't just a right, it's a responsibility. Get to the polls and encourage others to do the same. 9. Stay vigilant. Stay informed and be on the lookout for any new tactics designed to suppress your vote. Report instances of voter intimidation or suppression to local authorities or national watchdogs like the Election Protection Coalition. As we continue this fight for voting rights and equality, we must remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We shall overcome. The road ahead will not be easy, but just as Black Americans have overcome decades of injustice and oppression, so too can we overcome the challenges of today. True freedom is something worth fighting for. When Kamala Harris was denied the presidency due to voter suppression, it wasn't just her loss. It was a loss for all of us who voted for her. All of our votes were stolen for all intents and purposes. But we are not defeated. The African American spirit has fought and won before, and it will continue to do so in the future. Together we can ensure that justice prevails and that the promise of democracy is fulfilled for every citizen in this country. Just as Dr. King said, we are marching toward the day when we will proclaim, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. The fight is far from over, but we stand united in its pursuit, and together we will create a future where every voice, no matter the color or creed, will be heard and counted. Thank you for watching. Our channel, known as the Renaissance Spirit, is dedicated to the pursuits of a just, equitable, and humanitarian world. Video topics encompass areas including history, politics, religion, personal development, society, culture, social and environmental justice, and other topics of liberal arts and sciences, including ancient Rome and the Roman Empire, which is a great comparison and contrast of the modern world. Topics perfect for the true modern polymath. The Renaissance ushered in a golden age and the pursuit of knowledge both lost to time and yet to be discovered. It gave birth to the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. Embracing truth, knowledge, and an understanding and compassion for humanity and our shared history opens up the world to each of us individually and improves all of humanity, affording us the opportunity to be better stewards of the earth and to each other. The Renaissance Spirit, more than just a philosophy or style, but a style for living, learning, growing, and thinking. Please subscribe, turn on notifications, and share. If you're looking to explore and experience what life has to offer, I'm sure you'll enjoy the other videos on my channel. Please peruse, and let me know in the comments what you get out of them and what other videos you'd like to see. But first, please take the quiz next to see if you're a Renaissance Spirit. Live the Renaissance Spirit. History has not died, only our understanding of it